The way I describe it to people, it's like looking through like a 45 millimeter lens, and that's all you see. And not seeing at the full, 16 millimeter. Also, for driving at night, that my eye doctor does not recommend it. And I also like to compare it to cameras just because the way I see it's like a crop sensor versus a full sensor.
Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 372 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. This week on the podcast, I was honored to be joined by one of my favorite photographers, Brittany Colt. Brittany creates beautiful, evocative imagery from Yosemite, the Eastern Sierra, and Death Valley, and has a wonderful eye for composition and color. I'm also quite interested in her fine artwork, which we discuss at length today. Brittany was born blind in one eye, and you'll be very surprised to hear how that has impacted her as a photographer. I hope you enjoy today's discussion. Please join us for more conversation on Patreon and take some time to ponder some of the questions that I've posed to listeners there. Joining is free, but your support there is always welcome. Cheers. Just head over to patreon.com/fstop and listen. All right, let's get to this week's episode with Brittany Colt. All right, Brittany Colt, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I feel like for some reason your name just keeps getting thrown at me. Every time I ask people for recommendations, they're like, oh, have you heard of Brittany Colt? And I'm like, yeah, I've heard of her. And then I was just listening to another podcast the other day and your name came up again there. So you must be just putting out good vibes.
Oh, thank you. I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and of course your work is fantastic and your images are really wonderful and very engaging. So I'm sure there's a very good reason why people are making those comments.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Well, we first met way back in 2020 at Out of Yosemite when you were still working for the Ansel Adams Gallery, I believe, and we'll have some conversation about that particular part of your career later, but it's great to see you again.
Yeah, it's so good to see you again. I've just been following your work for a while, and it's just nice to talk to you in person once more.
So for people that aren't familiar with you, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
I was born and raised in Washington State. I've been a professional photographer for the last 15 years. I started out in the weddings and portraiture, honestly not by choice, but just by a little push and nudge from people around me, and that actually helped put me through college. And it wasn't until 6 years ago that I decided to make the switch and move to Yosemite and become a landscape photographer. And that's what I've been focused on for a while now, as well as incorporating my portrait work into the landscape.
That's awesome. It's funny, I literally just yesterday did a podcast with Alan Ross, who was also at Out of Yosemite with us. So there must be something about Yosemite that's just getting people on the show.
Yeah, and Alan's just a wonderful person. I've worked with Alan plenty of times, and yeah, it's cool that you got to speak with him.
Yeah, for sure. So what was it about Yosemite and landscape photography that had you make a switch?
Well, I ended up getting a divorce in 2018, and I knew I needed to restart my life. And with the divorce, our wedding business, because we were in the business together, dispersed. So I was like, I need a fresh start and a change. And it has been a long time dream of mine to work in a national park. Little did I know that I could be a photographer in a national park and teach photography. Actually, I had family that was born and raised in the valley, in Yosemite Valley. And so my cousin, around this time of my divorce, just messaged me out of the blue, and we got to talking, and she's like, we got to talking about getting me work in the valley. And she's just like, well, I know the perfect job for you, because she used to work at the gallery as well. And so that basically is what set me off to my next career.
That's fantastic. Well, I want to ask you some personal questions. So I understand that you're blind in your left eye, and you were born that way, right? How has that impacted how you see the world, both as a photographer and just in general?
Yeah, as a child, I really never considered myself disabled. This is how I've always seen the world. I do not know what it's like to have two working eyes. So I don't know any different. As a photographer, it definitely allows me I am more drawn to the intimate scenes just because of how I see. The only disadvantages I would have to say with my eyesight happened when I was 16 years old trying to learn how to drive. And I have issues seeing spatial recognition, how many feet is in front of you, right? When you're parallel parking or anything like that. So that's when I really felt that my disability it's never gotten in the way of anything that I wanted to do besides driving. So the way I describe it to people, it's like looking through like a 45 millimeter lens, and that's all you see. And not seeing at the full, 16 millimeter. Also, for driving at night, that my eye doctor does not recommend it. And I also like to compare it to cameras, just because the way I see it's like a crop sensor versus a full sensor. My ISO capabilities are very low compared to a full sensor camera.
Gotcha, but does it affect your depth of field?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yes, my depth of field for sure. So when it comes to driving, I feel it does get in the way, but other than that, I've lived a mostly normal life. Yeah.
Nice. Well, and now I'm curious, in what ways do you see your vision disability as perhaps an advantage? Meaning, how has it helped you differentiate yourself from the pack?
Yeah, I actually didn't discover this until I started teaching people photography. I'll get people out to this beautiful location, right? And they'll be so overwhelmed by it. They're like, I don't know what to photograph. Being out in nature, it's very chaotic, right? And then from your experience, being a nature photographer, it can be overwhelming. And I realized that the way I personally see is different. I can just look at a subject and just hone in on that subject, and I'm not distracted with all the chaos. So that definitely, it does help me in ways, for sure.
Now I'm curious. I'm wondering if people who are full-sighted, maybe we just need to walk around covering one of our eyes up to see if it helps us see the world differently.
For sure. Actually, it is a good practice. I mean, Ansel Adams taught with a 4x5 like matte frame,
right,
to teach people that.
Yeah, and Charlie Kramer as well. He has the Kramer framer or whatever, where he gives people different mats and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I find myself constantly doing that in the field, just with my hands. I'm like, doing this thing where I have different aspect ratios, and I'm zooming in and I'm zooming out. I'm blocking my field of vision. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you said about having somewhat of an advantage in terms of having limited vision, which is fascinating to think about because it's very counterintuitive. Oh,
very counterintuitive for sure. But then on the same token, I could be missing, a light over on my left side, so it does have its advantages and disadvantages for sure. But I feel like, people with two working eyes are so overwhelmed with the data they're taking in that they don't really know what the subject is. So that's when I come in, and I will just help them along on that journey.
That's brilliant. I recently did a workshop in Yellowstone, and we had this morning where we walked out onto this area that overlooked this huge valley, and there was amazing light, and there's a bison walking through a river, and then the river continues down and winds through the landscape, and everyone was just like, you could just see it in their eyes, like, this is overwhelming. I don't even know what to focus on. And it was a good opportunity for me to teach people, like, okay, you're overwhelmed. Like, let's take a step back. Let's draw inspiration from what we're initially drawn to. But it seems like you're not necessarily burdened with that particular challenge.
No, but I have to teach people to see that way. And I love it how you were telling your students just take a step back. Sometimes that's what we need, is taking the step back just to clear our head and then revisit it. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, so as you mentioned, you started out as a wedding and portrait photographer, and something else you haven't mentioned, but I happen to know, is that you also later obtained an education in graphic design. I'm curious how the pursuit of the wedding and portrait photography combined with the graphic design degree has aided you in your pursuit of landscape and nature photography.
Yeah, such a good question. Wedding photography definitely taught me how to be really fast on my toes, right? I'm going out and capturing this beautiful moment in this couple's lives, and I only have this one chance to capture it. And so I learned how to be technical, like my technical, to be really fast. Change it in 2 seconds. And I photographed on full-on manual, just because I like full control. Some wedding photographers will do aperture priority or something like that, just to make it easier on themselves. But for me, I like full control. And when I was photographing weddings, I had to learn how to even be creative on a fly. And so that translates perfectly to landscape, because Matt, Mother Nature does not wait for us photographers to change the lens, to change our aperture. Yeah. So I learned how to be really fast and be creative on the fly. When I lived in Yosemite, I was chasing a lot of clearing storms, and you're probably familiar with clearing storms, like light happen and then 5 seconds later the light is gone. So it definitely helped me to be really quick on my feet.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, it's funny. It's funny you mentioned the speed thing, because just a few days ago I was in Death Valley, and I was in a moment where the light was changing very fast, and I had taken my backpack off with all my lenses, and I left it at the top of this hill. Mm-hmm. And I saw this barrel cactus probably like 30 or 40 feet down the hill. So I went down the hill with my tripod and my wide angle, and then the light changed, and I needed my mid zoom, and I was like, oh, it's way up there. No. So I had to run up the hill, change lenses. So yeah, you're right. Having the skill of anticipation, thinking about what could happen in the future, those are all skills that you can learn very quickly by doing wedding photography.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I've had that situation happen to me several times, so I've learned, keep your backpack on your back, Brittany. Just keep it with you.
Yeah, I don't know what, I'm usually the same way, but I was just like, because I had carried like a 200 to 600 up there with me.
Oh, yeah. That's heavy.
Yeah, everything was heavy, and I wanted to be really nimble, because there was like several barrel cacti in this area, and so I wanted to be able to quickly move around and get it. And then, of course, the scene changed, and I was like, oops.
It happens to the best of us, for sure.
Yeah. Well, so you touched on the wedding photography side of things. How did your education in graphic design play a role in your development as a photographer?
Graphic design, to be honest, I was tortured going to college. I couldn't wait to graduate from high school, and then I went to college later on in life, I was 25, and so I was a professional photographer until that point, and I was like, okay, let's see what this graphic design is all about, and I was tortured, to be honest. I was living in Portland, Oregon at the time, and my campus had these cement buildings that just reminded me of a prison. And I told that to my teacher, and she's just like, you're right, this does feel like a prison. And you'd add another layer of gray and rain and gloominess to it. But with that, I'm really grateful for my graphic design background, just because it taught me so much. And when I started photographing landscapes, I realized like how it impacted my art. Because in graphic design, they're teaching you how to deal with space. And as photographers, that's what we are dealing with is space and how to minimize the chaos, right? And learning the graphic design elements really influenced my work. Paying attention to shapes and lines and textures and negative space and eye flow definitely is something that I'm all thinking about in one photograph. So it greatly impacted my work in so many ways, and I'm really grateful that I put myself through that torture of education, because I probably wouldn't be the photographer that I am today without it.
Yeah, I'm actually really jealous of that background because I'm sure it's giving you a huge advantage. And those are all concepts that I just kind of had to learn as I went and picked up on, or started noticing about other people's work that I admired. Oh, why do I like that? Oh, it's because they paid attention to texture. They paid attention to placement of objects and made for a pleasing composition. So I'm sure that helps you a ton. And then I'm also guessing that studying graphic design helps you a lot in terms of understanding color theory, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what types of colors you're trying to look for in order to make for a complementary landscape image.
Yeah, color can set the mood in so many ways, and graphic design, like you mentioned, definitely teaches you about color theory and then what mood and emotion that a color can bring to a photograph. I'm out there taking pictures of beautiful sunflowers, and the sunflowers are the color yellow, and we associate as humans yellow with fun and playful and inviting because that's the color of the sun. And as humans, we love the sun, we love to be outside. Or you could do the opposite. Blue gives you kind of a cool, moody feel. So knowing the theory behind color and how it makes the viewers feel definitely is informative in my work, for sure. I am thinking about all that as well.
Yeah, and then I had the luck of you sending me a bunch of images before this, because it'll hopefully have already come out before this episode airs, but I did an article on you and your photography for On Landscape magazine. And one of the images, a couple of the images that you sent over definitely spoke to some of what we've been discussing. One of the images in particular that caught my attention was an image that you sent over. It's the Owens River, and it's a black and white image of a snaking river kind of going back and forth. And one of the things that I was immediately drawn about that image, obviously the composition's awesome because it's got that winding river, but the river gets really, really, really close to the edge on the right. And a lot of people would say to give it more space on the right-hand side, but you chose to give it just enough breathing room to force the eye to go all the way back across the other side of the screen. So I'm curious if that was intentional or if that was just a happy accident.
That was intentional. And that was taken with a drone. But that was intentional. I like pushing boundaries. I'm much like Ansel Adams in that way. Ansel got kicked out of school so many times that they had to take him out of school. So I relate with him in a way. So I like pushing boundaries and making people step back and that's very interesting. And my advice I always like to give my clients is, if you can make people ask questions about your art, you're doing really well, because you're making them stay in your photograph as long as possible. So if you do something a little bit out of the ordinary, and make people question you as an artist or as a photographer, I say that's a win.
In photography, if there's ways to capture the attention of the viewer in surprising ways by breaking rules that other people might be afraid to break, I think that's a great strategy to employ. You had another image that you sent over called Two Friends at First Light. And again, it's a very, very simple scene with a ton of negative space. It has two tiny trees, big amount of snow, and then a mountain scene with some really nice clouds and light. And I feel like most people would be afraid to allow that much negative space to dominate the image, but the way that you composed it, it just somehow works. So maybe talk a little bit about how you incorporate negative space into your images.
Yeah, I love negative space because what negative space really does, it allows the viewer's eye to rest before it comes and fully sees your main subject. So, our human brains can get really, again, confused if we get too much information. And in graphic design, that's what they taught us. You intentionally put negative space in your design so that you have the viewer's eye to rest and before it can fully come in and appreciate the full photograph. So that's my theory behind negative space. And also in that photograph, I had leading lines as well that I was getting to lead you right into the mountains as well. So that's helping the eye flow of the image. People might see the two trees first, and then those lines are pushing your eye towards the mountains.
Yeah, I feel like without those lines, it might not be as effective. But to your point, the negative space, kind of a bold move, but also gives the viewer somewhere to kind of just chill for a second before being pulled up into the rest of the scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely more of a graphic design theory than a landscape photography theory.
Yeah, no, that's why I wanted to talk to you about this, because I feel like a lot of landscape photographers specifically, we're afraid to do stuff like that, or maybe you're not afraid. Maybe afraid is not the right word, but it's like it doesn't feel right. It's like, ooh, that's not what I'm supposed to do, right? So I think it's interesting that you're leveraging that experience in graphic design to make compositions that are different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like pushing my own creative boundaries and then pushing myself to create different photographs. I mean, I live in one of the most photographed places, in the world. Let's just face the facts. And so for me to go out and be creative, I'm not after, the Alabama Hill shots or, just the stuff you see every day online. I'm after creating unique perspective on where I live, and that also what drives me.
That was like the perfect segue. It's not like you just handed it to me on a silver platter, because my very next question is about that. So you had mentioned to me that a lot of your process and your workflow revolves around kind of quote unquote following the light, and you kind of let the light guide you and guide your decision making. How has that particular approach led you to find a unique voice in a crowded field such as Yosemite and the Eastern Sierra?
That's such a good question. So before I can answer that, I'm going to talk a little about my workflow and how I approach the valley. So I've never been to Yosemite until I moved there. And I really didn't know when I landed in Yosemite even what Half Dome or El Cap was. It was completely foreign to me. Sure, I had family there that lived and was raised in the valley, but my parents never took us to Yosemite. So I intentionally didn't do any research, and I was like, I want to see Yosemite Valley through my own perspective and not through anyone else's. So I wasn't influenced by other photographers, right? So that actually pushed me to create unique images, create photographs. As well, I was working at the Ansel Adams Gallery, so I was consumed with all the beautiful grand landscapes, right? As well as taking people out to these locations, guiding them. And when I wanted to create my art, I was like so sick and tired of looking at, the icons. They're beautiful and majestic, don't get me wrong, but I knew that there was more to photograph in Yosemite Valley that people weren't paying attention to. And so I did follow Ansel's philosophy, just follow the light. And the light led me to my subjects. And the light reveals subjects, right? And so my whole time being there in Yosemite and even here on the east side, I really focus on following the light, because that's so essential to how I create my photographs. So, some of my photographs are planned, especially when you're doing night sky photography, but, clearing storms, you never know what's going to happen. So, me going out and chasing the light has become a fun challenge, and also gave me opportunities that I wanted to have otherwise if I was focused on, let's just say, the icons.
Yeah, that resonates a lot with me. Like I said earlier, I just got back from Death Valley, and we had one day in particular that we knew was just going to be overcast all day long, no sun. And we were like, what do we want to photograph in this type of light? And it immediately struck us, like, we want to photograph abstract mud and rock stuff in the middle of nowhere, and just find stuff that catches our attention based on patterns and lines and shapes. And it was when I was with my friend Michael Bellino, and we were out there for like 5 hours. And he was like, that was the best day of photography I've ever had in my life.
Wow. Yeah,
You know?
it just, those days are amazing because you just let your creativity take over, and there's no expectations, right?
Right.
Yeah, I just love going out and just seeing what nature reveals to you, instead of like, I want this, dune shot or whatever it is. It's fun just to get lost in creativity.
Oh, and it's such a fun process because I'm always surprised about what nature provides to me. And I was just thinking about this the other day. I just so enjoy the process of engaging with nature in that way, letting it kind of gently guide me through the process a little bit, but then I have to show up as well in terms of responding and trying to figure out how to piece it together like a little bit of a puzzle, and then create something that's different. And I just find that whole interaction to be so enjoyable.
Yeah, it definitely challenges a person for sure.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned Yosemite that way, because we were talking about Out of Yosemite before earlier. And that was the first time I'd ever taught at a workshop, and I had never been to Yosemite before either. And so I'm sure everyone was wondering, like, what is this guy? What can he teach us about photographing in Yosemite? And what that experience taught me about myself is that this is going to sound really egotistical, but like I feel like I kind of now have developed this sort of superpower where I can just show up somewhere and let nature help kind of guide the process, and then find something that's interesting that catches my eye, and then photograph it in a way that hopefully not a lot of other people would have done before. And in Yosemite, I found myself doing that. I mean, as you remember, there was no clouds. Like 5-day conference, we didn't have a single cloud. And it's winter in Yosemite. There was no snow. So like none of the conditions that you would expect in Yosemite. But I did the same thing as you. I didn't look at a bunch of images, and I've got some of my favorite photos I've ever taken from that trip. Like a couple of trees that are in black and white, and this little slice of rock that's actually a big chunk of El Cap with just the last bit of light in it.
I love that.
But I mean, that's really what you're talking about, is like just letting the light guide your process, and then being open and just don't let your preconceived ideas dictate how you pursue the craft.
Exactly. And then like I feel after you've been photographing landscapes, you just develop your eye where you can show up to any location and just see magic.
Yeah, and that's what sets us apart, right? Like, and not us, but I mean, like, as photographers, the more we can leverage who we are, what we find interesting. Like you and me, we can go on the same hike together somewhere in the Eastern Sierra, and you're going to notice stuff that I would never notice, and I'll probably see stuff that you'd never see, and that's what makes us different,
Oh, and I love seeing that. You probably have experienced this in your workshop groups of like taking a group of 8 to 10 people out there, and everyone's coming up with all these different compositions, and I just love seeing people's creativity at the same location.
No, I love it too, and sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm so jealous. How did
I
I miss
that? But then, like, you see that, and then it inspires you, So
yeah. Well, as you mentioned, you spent a lot of time working as a photographer for the Ansel Adams Gallery, and you did a lot of teaching for them. How did working so closely with Ansel's work influence your approach to making photographs?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I was not a black and white photographer at all until I immersed myself in Ansel's work. To be honest, I hardly knew who Ansel Adams was until I landed in Yosemite. I'm like, oh, I'm going to have to teach about this photographer.
That's
it's
funny.
true. Yeah. But a lot of studying, a lot of reading, a lot of just looking at his photographs really inspired me. I believe when I saw his real gelatin silver prints that he printed in real life, that's when I was like, oh, that makes me feel something. I want to do that. So Ansel really, really helped to show me the beauty of black and white photography and changed who I am today, really. I really admire his work, and I also admire that he was a rule breaker, and he always was pushing those boundaries, and especially when it came to art. And that really inspired me for sure.
Okay, now I have to ask, because you said you didn't even know who Ansel Adams was before you went to work there. So you started studying his stuff. Did you have like a moment where you're like, oh, this is a big deal?
To get the job at the Ansel Adams Gallery?
Yeah.
Oh man, Matt, you could have seen me before my interviews. I had 3 interviews. I was studying like crazy. But luckily they weren't asking me anything about Ansel Adams. They were making sure that I was good technically, that I could teach. That was the main thing, that they wanted to make sure that I could teach really well. And I mean, I'm working for the Ansel Adams Gallery. Not everyone gets hired there and gets to be a staff photographer and work and live in the park.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about teaching. So I love that you said that they wanted to make sure you could teach. What in your mind makes for a great photography teacher? What are some of the skills or qualities of someone who is good at that?
Well, meeting people where they're at and making them feel comfortable as possible. And I learned that just by being a student myself. You know, in college there's some teachers I'm like, I don't want to go up and ask a question, or, you know, it is intimidating if you're in a class format. And so when I was taking a group of 10 people out in the valley, I just really wanted to make sure they're comfortable. And I would always tell them, there is no such thing as a stupid question. Just ask me all the questions. And be open, have that open energy that just really makes people want to soak up the knowledge and learn.
I love that you said meet people where they're at, because that's what I've found in my teaching is the most helpful thing to do is to think about every single student as an individual, and they're all different people with different backgrounds, different experiences, different personalities, different skill sets, different capabilities with the camera. And I feel like one of the things I see a lot of instructors do that might not be the best approach is treat everyone as if they're the same. You know, like if they're going on your workshop, you can't just assume everyone's at the same level. Even if they say they're all advanced or they're all beginners, there's probably lots and lots and lots of differences, and not only in terms of their skills with a camera, but just how they approach photography or what their learning style is or what. So I try to mix it all together and, you know, spend time with each person as much as I can and tailor what I'm showing that person based on kind of what their needs are. So I think it's really important what you just said, and I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, and that approach that you just mentioned is it's just how I approach it too. It's like, figure out the person's learning style, and you have to figure it out fast because you're, you know, on a workshop with them. But once you figure that out, then you can really get anything across to them. And those people usually really appreciate that you took the time to figure it out.
Yeah, I agree. So Brittany, like most full-time photographers, you have a lot of irons in the fire. Your work revolves around photographing people in nature, especially women, offering photo guiding, private mentoring, education services, and selling prints. Do you have a favorite?
No, I don't have a favorite. I'm a person that can easily get bored if I was doing the same thing over and over again, 9 to 5 jobs. So when I left the Ansel Adams Gallery, I really made sure I wanted to set up my life where I did have a lot of irons in the fire, but also a variety. I love educating people about photography and taking them out to beautiful locations. But I also like working and photographing people as well. I think all of it to me encompasses, just getting outside and enjoying it, whatever I'm doing. I guess the only thing about my job that I have to do, and you probably have to do yourself as well, Matt, is upselling yourself.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I do a great job of that.
I don't think us artists are very good at selling ourselves. And so, when you're selling a piece of art or selling your workshop or any of that, that's the one thing I really do struggle with. But when it comes to the job, I love what I do.
I think I want to talk more about this idea of upselling, because I think there's a fine line between upselling and being a little bit pretentious, right? Or bragging. Like, no one really likes people that are bragging constantly about their success. And it's hard to show your customer how different you are if you don't do a little bit of that. So, how do you figure out the difference between the two in your own approach?
I just come in really authentic, and you need to get people to trust you. If you're authentic and honest, and people can tell that you're trustworthy, I think, people will trust you enough to buy a workshop or buy a photograph of yours. I think that's the main thing, is just coming in and not having the energy of a salesperson, but coming in with an open energy where someone feels comfortable enough to want to hire you for whatever you offer.
Yeah, that's my approach as well. I'm glad that you agree. I just always question whether or not that's the best approach or not. I do see other photographers taking a slightly different approach in terms of every time they sell a print, they post a story about it on Instagram and show how big it is, and oh, these customers are so happy, and it's every 5 days or 3 days they're posting stories about all these print sales, and it's I get it, people respond to that, but at the same time, it feels a little salesy.
For people who have the guts to do that, hats off to them. I definitely, like to be more authentic than that. But it must be working for them.
Well, who knows? That's the funny thing about social media, right?
Yeah.
You can say all kinds of things about how amazing and incredible and successful you are, but no one can see your bank account.
Exactly.
Yeah. And trust me, mine's never that full, so.
Well, you are a photographer. Ansel Adams he struggled for years with money. I don't think he really made a ton of money until he ended up passing away, and his art was being sold for thousands, so we're all in the same boat.
Yeah, what's the joke? If you want to make money as a photographer, sell a camera?
Almost, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. Well, so you mentioned in that bit of conversation there that you enjoy photographing people in nature. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what that looks like for you. Are these models? Are these people who are paying you to capture their likeness in nature? What does that look like for you?
Okay. So after 3 to 4 years of really focus on landscape photography, I got bored and I wanted to push myself and put the human in the landscape. My photo series that I just started, actually 2 years ago, was my nude photo series, The Feminine Form in the Landscape. And I wanted to include it in a way that I'm capturing the landscape as well as the feminine form. So that was a whole new challenge for me, because I've never photographed anyone in the nude. I mean, honestly, that's their most vulnerable state as humans. And this project actually really scared me just because of that. It's really was hard for me to be like, oh, were you like to model the nude for me? But honestly, I asked a couple of my friends that I was comfortable with asking, and then people just started coming to me. They just loved the idea. Women trusted me, which I felt so honored. And that was just a really humbling endeavor for me as an artist, that women were trusting me to capture themselves in their most vulnerable state. So it was a great challenge.
So I know you're doing a whole project of nudes in the landscape, like you just mentioned, but is this also paid client work on top of that?
No, this is just a passion project. I
Gotcha.
mean, if someone wanted to pay me to do it, for sure. I haven't put that out as an offering yet, but maybe in the future. I'm just working with friends and other models that just want to get out in nature, and it is kind of a newer thing. I've been doing it for the last 2 years and didn't reveal this project until this year. And I had my solo show with Nature's Daughters, which is the photo series. I call it Nature's Daughters Embracing the Sacred Bond. So yeah, it's very new, and I could offer it to people, but not just yet.
Well, I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into that, because I'm curious, as someone with the background in graphic design and portraiture and weddings, and now landscape and nature with Ansel Adams infused into you, what is the combination you're looking for in terms of adding the model with the landscape? Like, how are you trying to combine those two things in a way that is cohesive?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I'm looking at different textures. I'm looking at lines. So I pre-scout all my locations before I take a nude model out to a location, just because I want to be prepared as possible. And so I'm looking for cool, interesting features that might not look as good in a photograph. Like caves and like cool rocks and stuff. But when you put a human in it, man, it just transforms that whole scene. And so I'm looking for interesting trees and different cool rocks. I really like big boulders and all that. So that's basically, I pre-scout, and then I'll put the human in landscape. And usually the poses is just a combination of the model and me. We're being creative together, we're flowing together. And that's what I like working with people, is being creative with others. It just gives me an opportunity to just open that door for the other person to be creative as much as me.
That makes sense. And what is your why for this type of work? What are you hoping to accomplish?
Such a good question. So I hope to accomplish that. I feel like there's a lot in our society as women, there's a lot of pressure on us to be a certain way in our feminine forms. And I find all feminine forms just so beautiful no matter what. But we deal with all this outside societal pressure. And so I wanted to create a space for women where they can be themselves in nature, and being nude in nature is like one of the most comfortable feelings that you can possibly have as a human, just because it just feels so natural. And so that was my whole idea behind the project, was encourage women that all bodies are beautiful no matter what, and have Mother Earth just cradle you in her beautiful surroundings that she has for us. So basically that's why I wanted to do the project, to encourage women to step outside their comfort zones, and also to self-love our bodies that we're in, because we don't choose our bodies, but we have to learn how to accept ourselves. And so it was more of a project about self-love.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it's not very often I find that people are able to combine landscape photography with a societal issue that they find of importance, and so I think that has a lot of lasting power in terms of making an impact, and also like, it checks the box of people appreciating it as more than just landscape photography. Not that that's anything wrong with that, but it's got that fine art feel to it.
Yeah, and with the fine art feel, like all these photographs are in black and white, and that definitely helped out to get that fine art feel. I feel that the feminine form just looks so good in black and white. Like, is at that point, it's all about the light, right? It's all about how the light hits the body and the landscape. And yeah, it was a really wonderful challenge for me to step outside that comfort zone, work with models once again, and re-familiarize myself with even directing people.
Awesome. Well, it's become clear to me that one of the things that you're very passionate about is uplifting other women in photography. Why is that particular issue important to you?
It's very important to me. Like, my experiences that I had, especially making the switch to landscape photography, I think where wedding photography, I didn't feel it because there's so many women in wedding photography. But landscape photographers, it's, less so, less percentage of women. And it just came out of a heart-centered where I recognize women are kind of intimidated in group settings, especially when they're surrounded by the opposite sex. So I want to empower women and teach them about this beautiful art form so that they're not intimidated, that they can just go out and be creative, that this art form's for everyone. So that's why I'm very passionate about teaching women and empowering them. And I had no one teach the struggle of trying to learn and grow in the art form. And so that's why I became an educator, because I didn't want that knowledge just for a group of people. It needs to be for everyone.
Yeah, I can imagine being such a male-dominated field, which it is. I mean, it's just a fact. I can imagine that can leave you feeling kind of out of sorts. Have you had any situations where you felt like people weren't taking you seriously in your position as a photographer because of your gender?
For sure. Since I was the education coordinator, so I coordinated all the workshops, our week-long workshops at the Ansel Adams Gallery, and I was teaching classes and guiding, I had to jump through a lot of hurdles to gain respect, just with clients. So I did this experiment. Before I sent an email out to a client, I would include my website, and that I felt it was a switch. It was just like a flip of a switch where I instantly started getting respect because people saw my portfolio. They knew that I was good, that I knew what I was talking about. But when I wasn't doing that, because at the Ansel Adams Gallery, I wasn't supposed to promote myself at all, so I wasn't sharing my website. It was harder to gain that respect from people. And I would get emails from people researching things online and what I said and and apologize later, like, you were right, I'm sorry I argued with you. So, but when I started, sharing my website, that's when I was gaining that respect from photographers.
And on the flip side, I'm curious, what advantages have you found that you've been able to leverage because of the fact that you're a woman in landscape photography?
I think just making other women feel very comfortable. Women naturally are comforters, right? And even with some men I saw that were more intimidated, I felt like they could relax more around me and they can let their egos go, and they can just be creative. And I love that. I love making that environment comfortable for anyone to learn.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've had a lot of conversations on this podcast about that particular subject, but I do think that women might have an advantage over men that sometimes gets overlooked in terms of fitting a niche that is often overlooked in terms of what people need, especially in the education space, in photography. Like you said, being a teacher it's a nurturing thing, and I found oftentimes men aren't always the best nurturers. So I think leveraging the strengths that you have as a woman, obviously we're generalizing here, but leveraging those strengths, I think, gives you an advantage that perhaps other people might not have.
Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of education, I know that you're doing a ton of education now in your work. What do you feel is missing from modern photography instruction and education?
That's such a good question. What I see that modern photography and education really excels at is all the technical. Like, they're just getting people really good with their cameras technically, teaching them focus stacking and all that. But I feel like sometimes what is missing is talking about what emotions we can portray through our photography and how people react to our photographs. I mean, at the end of the day, art is very subjective, so everyone's going to have a different emotion about it. But photography and art in general is, people are going to buy an art piece because they had an emotional response. You know, like they could have visited an area or it just made them feel good looking at the photograph. So that's why people buy art in general. So I think that what is missing is talking more about that emotion and how we can draw out that emotion through our photography.
What are some of your approaches to doing that with your own work?
You know, when you're out in the field, recognizing how you're feeling when you're photographing it and then bringing it back home and really portraying that emotion through the edit. And, you know, you have, like, just say you went for a darker, deeper, moodier edit, you're going to get that moody feeling. Or if you go for like a high key edit, you get that softer, more feminine feel. It also depends on subject, because in graphic design, this is what we studied, is like different like lines. Let's say if you have a lot of jagged lines, craggy branches, you know, that's going to give someone a different feeling than taking pictures of a very smooth, soft sand dunes, right? You get a different feeling behind it. And when you're out in the field, like when I'm out in the field, I recognize what emotion I'm feeling, so that when I take into the digital darkroom, I can really enhance that emotion.
I love that. Yeah, it's not to generalize this, but I'm going to again. But a lot of my favorite photographers are women, because I feel like they have a more innate ability sometimes to leverage that emotional connection with the photographs that they capture. And I find with a lot of men, and especially with my own work, a lot of times the emphasis is on getting it right. Does that make sense? Like, oh, the sunset was like this, and so that red is like slightly off, and those blues are too cyan, or gosh, I don't think that color is exactly the same color as what the aspen trees looked like that day. And that's oftentimes I feel like what people's goals are with their images, whereas I feel like if your approach to editing is more about conveying a feeling that you want to portray with the photograph, it's going to lead you down a very different path.
It definitely does. You just said it so perfectly. Because like all the photographers that looked at my photographs are just like, I just got a feeling. That's how they describe my work. Oh, I just got a feeling. I looked at your image, I got a good feeling, you know? And I was like, wow, that's interesting, you know? It really made me step back and actually think about it. And like, you know? But then I realized what I was doing naturally. I wasn't like, when I'm editing, it is all about a feeling. Oh, stop right there. You know, if you go, you're going to go way too far, you know? It is more about that feeling, and also recollecting what I was feeling out in the field. That also helps me with trying to capture that emotion.
Yeah, and I think it's hard for a lot of people like myself who maybe either don't remember what I was feeling, or maybe I wasn't feeling anything, or, you know, nothing that sticks out. And so I really appreciated, a couple of weeks ago, I recorded with Tony Hewitt, who just won International Landscape Photographer of the Year. And his advice was really simple. It was, when you're in the field and you just photographed a really nice scene at sunset or whatever, or maybe it's gloomy, whatever, just in your voice recording, pull up your iPhone, just record like 3 things about what you remember about what you just photographed. Like, oh, it was really cloudy and I was cold and I was really hungry and kind of grumpy. And that's going to come through in the edit if you remember that, right? And so, and then that little extra spiciness, I feel like, is going to carry the image a little bit further and help it connect with the viewer in a way that perhaps getting it right might not.
Yeah, I just love that advice. It kind of takes you back to the film days where we were writing down all our settings and like the conditions and stuff. Like, I just love that advice because, with digital, we can easily not do that. So he gave great advice. And also another thing that has helped, sometimes I have to wait to edit my photos because I might not be in a good mood after I photograph. Let's just, like you're saying, you deal with all these intense conditions and you're cold and you're frustrated. Things start freezing up, tripod legs, whatever it is. So like sometimes I just have to take a step back, and I still go through my archives that photographs I made 6 years ago, and I'm like, wow, how did I miss that? But I had to take a step back to see the magic.
Yeah, I think Ian Plant calls that dumpster diving.
Yeah. It's so true. Yeah.
But you can get some really good stuff by doing that.
Yeah, it's surprising how much I skip over in the first initial review until a few years later. I'm like, how the heck did I miss that? That's crazy.
I know. But it's kind of neat. Like, the longer you do it, the larger your dumpster is to go diving into.
Oh, it's so much fun.
Yeah.
Especially when you're stuck with, the blue sky days and there's nothing to photograph, so you might as well go dumpster diving.
Oh, there's plenty to photograph on a blue sky day. Come on.
Oh, yeah, there is, but sometimes the inspiration's not there.
There is that. Maybe that's something I could ask you about, because I hear that a lot from photographers, not just full-time photographers, but people who maybe just do it on the weekends or whatever, that oftentimes they just don't find that the inspiration is there to pick up the camera or to go looking for images. I'm guessing you've experienced that as well. What do you do in those moments?
Just let yourself relax. I mean, we all experience creative burnout at some point. And creatives need a time to rest and recuperate. And I found just getting into a good book or just doing something that you love, another hobby, whether it's mountain biking, hiking. For me, it's getting out in nature and just hiking. That really re-inspires me, and I see things and I was like, wow, that's cool. I never saw that angle on Mount Tom before. That helps me to get past that creative burnout.
Yeah, I do the same thing. If I'm feeling like I don't want to take images, I'll just go for a long hike, maybe even somewhere I've never been before. Try something new, and don't even bring the camera. And then you're like, oh, I wish I would have brought the camera. But then it's like a reminder that, yeah, you just need to try something else, and maybe the inspiration will strike you when you don't realize it's hitting you.
Exactly. That's definitely helped me for sure.
All right. Couple more questions. Tell us about your photography services through what you call the flying dress experience. What is that?
Yeah, so the flying dress is really popular in other countries. It's really not popular here in the States. So in Greece, Italy, Mexico, and high tourist areas, it's taken off. So basically these women are getting their photos taken in this beautiful long dress, and someone else I have to have an assistant, so my assistant will make the dress fly up, and I'm just on a really fast shutter speed capturing that action. I kind of fell into it just because, well, I wanted another creative outlet, and last summer I just bought one of those dresses, the flying dress, and my sister was just modeling for me, and then someone brought it to my attention, like, Brittany, you realize, like, that is a thing. And I was like, what? Really? So I did a huge research. I was like, wow, like I live in a tourist area. I can offer this. And most of the time people are at fancy resorts getting their photo taken, and I wanted to have my own unique spin on it and take people out into nature and work with women. Again, I'm really passionate about working with women. So, and I feel that, you know, especially in this modern world, there's not many opportunities as women where we can get dressed up and dolled up and be out in nature and getting our photo taken. And, you know, people do that for their wedding and stuff. But what about, you know, a special occasion, a special birthday, like a 40th birthday? So I really wanted to offer that and offer people an experience. That's why I called it the flying dress experience, because it is giving women an experience and taking them out to nature and capturing them at their best. And as a photographer, it really humbles me when someone comes to me and said, wow, I've never had anyone photograph me this way. Thank you so much. You showed me my true beauty. And I really appreciate that as an artist, because that's what my whole mission is for this offering.
Genius. I feel
Thank
like
you.
Hopefully no one steals your idea, but even if they do, like, you know, it's high tide rises all ships, in my opinion. So
Right. The more the merrier at this point. In the States, we need as much people to know about it as possible.
Yeah. All right. Well, last question. Who do you recommend for the podcast? Who are some photographers that you feel like our listeners need to learn more about?
Sean Reeder, he's a great photographer. He started out as a climbing photographer and landscape photographer, and then about 15 years ago he became a professional time-lapse artist. So he was on the cusp of that. So he would be really interesting to talk to. Another local photographer, I absolutely love her. Her name is Samantha Lindberg. She lives in Mammoth, and she just does beautiful work with the grander scenes. I just love her. I admire anyone who can do grand scene photography, since that's not my specialty. And then Jill Sanders, she lives on the coast, and her scenes are always so breathtaking. So I think those three people would be really interesting.
Awesome. Well, Brittany, this was awesome conversation, and I just loved speaking with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Matt, and it's really awesome to reconnect with you after all these years.
Yeah, likewise. Well, thank you to Brittany for the wonderful conversation today. I really enjoyed it, and I can't wait to see your photography continue to evolve. Keep up the inspiring work. I am really rooting for you. Be sure to check out links to Brittany's concepts and services by visiting all of the links in the show notes. Lastly, I would be forever grateful if you were to subscribe to the podcast, leave a positive review of the podcast, and any other way that you can signal to the universe that you enjoyed the chat today. Cheers. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.